Welcome to Achieve More When Demands Are High and Time is Short webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Michelle MacArthur Morgan, and I'm the founding partner and creator of the Jigsaw Discovery Tool. For the past 22 years now, actually, I've spent most of my time studying, researching, working with applied brain science. First of all, my background started off in kind of psychology, but then since 2008, very much been studying and kind of, even to this day, continue studying neuroscience. So in actual fact, next week, I'm going to a neuroscience global summit to see some of the latest findings that have gone on there in the last 12 months or so. I'm also a mindfulness practitioner, and I've had my own mindfulness practice now for about 30 years. I think I've been practicing mindfulness on a personal level. So with our webinars, I want to start just by giving you all a chance just to be present and focused on how are you feeling right now in this moment. So just using chat, actually, if you want to pop in chat, how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 6, where 1 is, you know, it's Friday, you're tired, it's the end of the week, perhaps a bit fed up, stressed, frustrated, not feeling that great. And 6 is where you're feeling really energized, mentally refreshed and ready for anything, really. So where are you sitting at the moment? An answer in chat for me, somewhere between 1 and 6. How are you feeling right now? 3s and 4s, brilliant. 4s. Considering it's Friday, that's really, really great. Excellent. Okay, well, for the next 45, 60 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at the importance of self-awareness, and that link between awareness and performance is what we're really, and well-being obviously, is what we're really going to be looking at. Why working within the brain's capacity and capability will help us to improve performance. We're going to be talking about managing distractions and taking back some control, and also how to work in a more brain-friendly manner and stop ourselves from feeling so exhausted at the end of the working day. But we're going to start off with our current reality and just take a quick look at the current reality. So our lived experience the past 2 years have had quite a depletive effect on the emotional well-being of ourselves, our colleagues, our leaders, our families and our friends. And we've all lived with that constant change and uncertainty, but the experience has been very, very different for everyone. Now that the pandemic is subsiding, that real impact of the last couple of years is starting to actually take its toll. And it's very evident that it's going to take an awful lot more than just having a holiday or joining a gym to actually regenerate ourselves, our team members, our workforces. They published by People Management on the 28th of January. It was reported that widespread workplace stress and anxiety are contributing to a significant drop in productivity. And the survey looked at a period of over 2 years, actually, up to December 2021. And what the survey found was that 67% of employees were experiencing moderate to high levels of stress. And more than 28% reported seeing their productivity negatively impacted over the last couple of years. Additionally, employees said that they felt fatigued. And a similar number, 53%, actually said that their tiredness was impacting negatively upon their productivity at work. What kind of lived experience? Just a reflective question, really, for yourselves. What's your lived experience of the last couple of years, or that of your colleagues? What is it that has been causing us all the kind of the stress and the fatigue? Why are we now feeling as we are doing? Well, the main causes cited by the employees in the study that was carried out were workload, the high volume of workload, people's lack of control. They just felt everything was totally out of their control and they had very little control. And feelings of being less supported, working, being many people working from home rather than having the colleagues sitting at the side of them and around them. They found that they kind of lost that kind of support. So those were the sightings of why employees thought that they were feeling stressed, anxious, fatigued at the moment. That was published again in People Management on the 1st of February. And I would really suggest reading this. I found this a very informative, but I'll give you a kind of the overview of it. And it was written by Stephen Bevan, who's the head of HR research at the Institute for Employment Studies, and Sir Gary Cooper. You may know him through CIPD, but he's also the Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at the Manchester Business School. And in their article, they stated that UK PLC needs to see the workforce's physical and mental health as a major contributor to productivity. And they go on changing the way that as organizations, as senior leaders and managers, we actually see health. And we need to start seeing it as an appreciating asset of our organization rather than a burden. And we need to start investing in well-being, thinking from the perspective of it being a major contributor to the productivity of our workforces. So they believe now is the time to harness the well-being of the workforce and actually see it as the third factor of production, and equally as important, if not actually more important, than investing in skills and technology. So investing in skills and technology alone going forward, they argue, is not enough. We need to invest in the well-being of our workforce if we want to have those higher productivity levels that we so badly need. During the pandemic placed well-being high on the agenda. Not all did. And now, as we emerge from the pandemic into a world that remains unstable, with very little certainty, rising inflation, unprecedented energy levels, staff shortages, well-being is starting to slip down the agenda for some leaders. In the article by Stephen and Gary, they cited a senior executive of a large, well-known employer, saying that stress at work is a much more effective driver of productivity than any so-called well-being program. So stress at work is a much more effective driver of productivity than any so-called well-being program. I think the senior exec is not alone in their belief. A minority, although it is a significant minority of employers, do believe that focusing on well-being is tantamount to kind of pandering too much to the needs of employees. And it doesn't give sufficient attention to the kind of driving productivity through targets and financial incentives. So, is it now time to get rid of that idea that leaders have to choose between high productivity or workforce well-being? Are the two really contradictory? Does it have to be an either or? In chat for me, have you actually seen, as we've started to emerge, perhaps, this year, as we've started to emerge perhaps a little bit from the pandemic, have you started to see well-being sliding down the agenda, perhaps within your organisations or other organisations that you know? You just want to pop your thoughts in chat, or is it still high up there as a high priority? Gliding down agendas, do you think? Even generally, please, I'm not asking for you to disclose anything. Lots of lip service to it. But in practice, it doesn't feel like it's truly there. Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's very much my experience of it. Low priority, rush to return to pre-pandemic productivity at the expense of well-being. Yeah, at present, yes, still a priority, but I've noticed less since beginning of pandemic. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very much what we're seeing in organisations, that it is actually starting to slip a little bit in the majority of them. Not everybody, but in the majority. And as I say, please do read the article, and I'll at the end pop some links into chat to the articles. Then, according to Stephen and Gary Cooper, there are 5 areas that organizations need to prioritize on if they want to really harness that ingenuity, the creativity, the resourcefulness, and the energy that a healthy workforce has to offer. So again, pop in ideas what you think those 5 areas that organizations need to focus on to develop a healthy workforce. What do you think some of those 5 areas could be? Work-life balance. Yeah. Do organizations need to be focusing on now, do you think? Really harness that well-being, productivity. Well, trust that staff are doing their best and support them to work flexibly. Yeah, yeah. Trust, a very important word. Rest during busy periods, even struggling. Interestingly enough, the 5 areas quoted in the article, the first one, and this actually kind of links in very much to what you're putting there in chat, is line management capability. The relationship between employees or an employee and their line manager can either unlock the employee's productivity or it can stifle it. And it can even go as far as disengaging even the most motivated employee in a business. Line managers need to have higher levels of emotional intelligence and empathy. Time spent with their people, as in listening to, supporting, collaborating as a priority and an essential part of their role. Now, many managers know this and they actually want to do more of it, but often, certainly when they're kind of in middle management kind of roles, they've got pressure being put on them from above for more kind of task-driven priorities. Their senior managers are chasing them for reports, for information, etc., which takes away the time that they then have to focus on their people. So line management capability is actually one of the areas. It's occupational health, actually making use of the expertise that is available in many organisations within their occupational health expertise, and actually getting occupational health and the kind of the senior leaders of organisations to have conversations around how they can actually help and support the health and well-being of their staff. Prevention. Now, prevention is a subject that I have been speaking about long before the pandemic. I truly believe that organisations have been approaching health and well-being from totally the wrong perspective historically. Certainly pre-pandemic, the norm was reactive, what I call the sticking plaster approach. Wait until somebody's poorly and goes off ill and then offer them some form of support. Some organisations tried to be a little bit more proactive and were offering perhaps gym memberships or held occasional wellbeing days and things like that. But you know what? It takes an awful lot more than that, than a gym membership to prevent burnout and enable the growth of a happy and healthy workforce. We also learn from the pandemic. The pandemic messed out in just about everybody. The majority of employers were displaying an impressive level of agility and flexibility, risk-taking, empathy and compassion. And that resulted in a real shared sense of purpose and real trust developing between employees and their leaders, as employees were looking to the leaders to steer the way through for guidance through the kind of all the uncertainty and the unknown. Sure that we actually continue to maintain and further develop that shared purpose and understanding, to continue building that trust and strengthening relationships. And last but not least, and actually Joanna actually popped it into chat, inclusivity, but specifically in relation, not just, you know, I'm not saying just specifically in relation to health, but one area to think about is that link between inclusivity and productivity. And just because a team member has a chronic illness, it shouldn't imply that they're going to be any less productive. Managers need to focus more on capacity rather than incapacity. And certainly, you know, in my experience, I found that often employees who have health challenges are some of the most resourceful and conscientious employees. But a lot of it is to do with our attitude and mindset from the line manager, from the organisation. And we see their illness first, whereas we should be seeing the individual and looking at their capacity rather than the incapacity. So focus on these 5 areas within our organisations, then this should help us create work that is more regenerative. Employees should will feel fulfilled and able to do some of their very best work to be at the most productive without that risk of fatigue, exhaustion and burnout. Webinar, we're going to be exploring how you can develop sustainable and regenerative ways of working that will support the emotional and physical well-being of yourself, of your team, your organisation, enabling more productive and fulfilling work. On the road to more regenerative working is self-awareness. And there is a direct link between self-awareness, well-being and levels of performance. The more self-aware an individual is, the more likely they are to have higher levels of well-being and ultimately higher levels of productivity. Now, as Stephen and Bevan and Gary Cooper pointed out in their research, line managers need to have higher levels of emotional intelligence and empathy. And that all starts with self-awareness. One of my favourite studies was actually carried out by Green Peak Partners, who are an international consulting company, and Cornell University. And between 2005 and 2008, they carried out a study involving 72 senior leaders across 30 different organisations. And the study went against what at the time was thought to be conventional wisdom. And that was that the no-nonsense approach to leadership would provide the biggest return. But in actual fact, found was with leadership, business leadership, the nice guys finished first. And that's the name of the report. If you want to look it up, it's readily available on the internet. And specifically within that report, they break it down. And they found that poor interpersonal skills lead to underperformance. Leaders who interpersonal skills scores were low also scored poorly on just about every single performance dimension. They also found go down, if at all mentioned, in organisations as one of the criteria that they looked for when looking for recruiting leaders. Now, it's argued, therefore, that actually it should be high on the list because, interestingly, a high self-awareness score was the strongest predictor of overall success. Now, that's not altogether surprising if we think about it, because leaders who have higher levels of self-awareness not only understand their strengths, they also understand their weaknesses or their blind spots. And they're often then better able to hire team members who have skills and talents that complement their own. To ask for help if it's in an area that they know is a particular blind spot for themselves. They're also more likely to listen to and evolve and collaborate team members and actually feel comfortable with team members coming up with ideas or solutions that could be better than their own. Now, what the research didn't actually, though, the researchers didn't expect to find when they started out on this report was that the bully traits are often seen, that at that time certainly was seen very much part of a business building culture, as being too arrogant, being direct, too direct, should I say, being impatient and stubborn, actually correlated with low performance ratings. And not surprisingly, the leaders who scored low in these areas actually were not very good at managing their people, managing talent, inspiring their workforce, or in fact, of being a team player. Awareness and understanding is a journey. It's an ongoing process. And a few ways of raising self-awareness. And it's always best to have a combination of these. I must stress that point. But a few ways you can start to raise self-awareness is asking for feedback from your peers, your managers, family, friends, and colleagues. If you work with a coach or a mentor, asking them for some feedback, 360-degree feedback activities. Self-reflection is very, very important. Taking time out, perhaps using journaling, meditation, being mindful in the moment, spending time in the present, checking in with yourself, getting in touch with your inner thoughts and feelings. A little bit like we did at the beginning of the session today. I asked you just very quickly, what's going on for you right now? How are you feeling? We can do the same with our inner thoughts and feelings. Just stop while you make yourself that next brew, while the kettle's boiling, just actually, or while you walk to the boiler, just ask yourself, what's going on for me? What's my thoughts? What's my thinking at the moment? And of course, behavioral profiling tools, and lots of tools available out there. So some 21 years ago now, when I created, along with my colleague, Keith Nicholson, the Jigsaw Discovery tool, it was my aim in doing that was to support people in developing their levels of self-awareness and understanding. And the starting point for our learners on our Jigsaw Learning Pathway is creating their own personal behavioural maps. There's no questionnaires. Learners are totally immersed. We take them on a journey, learning about themselves using a number of activities, using kind of 4-piece and 64-piece jigsaws, which ultimately leads to that creation of the behavioural map. And then the learners begin to explore that map, identifying their many strengths, their behavioural preferences, along with the blind spots. And they look at how this new understanding can then help them to enhance the relationships, the communication, the well-being, and ultimately performance. Time today to discuss all the individual preferences, but to give you kind of an illustration of how increased self-awareness can lead to improved well-being and performance. I'm just going to look at just one axis of behavior, and it's one that everybody will be very familiar with, I'm sure: introversion and extroversion. So by identifying where you sit on an axis, what we call your home base, the natural you can then use this knowledge to help you make more informed choices that will support your well-being and performance. By completing a behavioural profile or map, as learners do in our workshops, they're able to understand the behaviours then that are draining on their energy levels and which are energising on their energy levels. Now, have you got a pen and paper to hand? Hopefully you have. If you have, what I'd just like you to do is, just on a piece of paper, just write for me your first and last name. What I'd like you to do is put your pen in the other hand and write your first and last name again, please. Like the second time around. What did it feel like? What did you notice about doing it? Just pop into chat for me. What did you notice about it? Takes more effort with the other hand, yeah, much slower, unnatural, challenging, really heavy concentration second time. Yeah, you had to shut out distractions, felt strange. Absolutely. Behavioral preferences are exactly the same. When we're working from our preference, it's enjoyable, it helps to energize, it helps to maintain our energy levels. But when we're working from a lesser preference, or a backup, as we call it, it can be draining. And if we're forced to do it for too long, it then starts to impact upon our well-being and ultimately our overall performance. So an example of this knowledge would be when you need to do a task that requires you to work from one of your lesser preferred behavioral preferences. So and sit on the introversion and extroversion axes can then inform us about the type of environment that is more likely to drain our energy and add to the draining of the energy, the fact that we're doing a task that isn't actually working to our preferences. So for me personally, I'm an introvert. So if I'm doing a task which means me working from a lesser preferred preference, behavioral preference, then I can make that task less draining by choosing to work in a quieter environment, somewhere where there's minimal distractions. I might choose to work from home, for example. I might choose to put on out of office messages on emails, put voicemail on my phone. Whereas as an extrovert, they would probably find that type of environment actually draining on them, and they'd be far happier working in a more productive environment. A more productive environment for them would be somewhere where there's things going on, so such as working from within an office where there is a bit of a buzz going on, or perhaps even working from a coffee shop may be more preferable for them. So the more self-aware that we become, the more control we can have over our well-being and our productivity. Self-awareness has so many different benefits on so many different kind of levels. So there's just a few things that actually higher levels of self-awareness can lead to. But it will help us with understanding the actions and motivations of other people as well. It can help us to adapt and change our behavior to suit the situation, the environment. It can help us in coaching situations. It can help us deal with change better, our client relationships and sales situations, negotiation and leadership of others. So as the list on screen, all of those factors influence and contribute towards our well-being and how we overall perform our productivity. And look a little bit more about the brain itself. And despite the brain being a very powerful organ, it has limited capacity, which, if we ignore that, leads to overwhelm and impaired cognitive functioning. So when we try to do fairly simple tasks at the same time, such as, and I'm sure we're all guilty of this, being in a meeting and answering your emails at the same time, or even just looking at your emails whilst in a meeting, what you're attempting to do is to multitask 2 or more cognitive tasks at the same time, which neuroscience has shown us isn't possible. It doesn't matter, I know, as a female, many of us think that we're we're able to multitask. In actual fact, human beings cannot multitask. The reality is, when we think we're multitasking, is that the brain is switching backwards and forwards at great speed, switching between the 2 tasks. Now, the effect of that is it puts too much pressure onto the brain to function effectively. And the outcome is our stress response is triggered, so we start to feel stressed. Our cognitive thinking, our ability to think and come up with good decisions and clarity of thought actually is impaired. Our IQ gets reduced on a temporary basis while we're attempting to do 2 or more things by up to 10 points, which is the equivalent to taking drugs. It's harder to make good decisions. It also, by attempting and keep trying to do 2 or more cognitive tasks at the same time, it increases our inability to maintain focus, so that when you need to focus and concentrate, you're making it so much harder for yourself. But also, in regards to productivity, it's actually up to, or lowers, should I say, productivity by up to 40%. Interesting kind of facts just to remember is, at any one point in time, your conscious mind can hold a maximum of 3 pieces of information. Fact to be aware of is the subconscious mind and conscious mind operate simultaneously. However, the subconscious mind processes 11 million pieces of information per second, compared to 7 pieces, not 7 million, 7 pieces of information per second in our conscious mind. And I'll go on in a second, you'll see why that's an important factor. So the prefrontal cortex is where the majority of our conscious processing takes place. The conscious processes such as language, problem solving, decision making operate mainly in that rational, logical part of the brain called the cortex. The limbic brain is our emotional subconscious processing. They're rooted in our survival instinct, the emotional brain, that fight or flight. And it has a very primitive processing mechanism. When we put on our conscious mind, i.e. trying to multitask is a good example, it means that our subconscious minds will step in and take control. So take a look at a few kind of strategies and practices now that support a much more brain-friendly and sustainable way of working. Start first of all by talking about our working memory. It is part of our conscious brain, the prefrontal cortex. Cognitive processes take place, helping us to make sense of things, to remember things, and they assist in our decision-making processes. Memory has very limited capacity. It's very energy intensive, and it's also very easily distracted. Use about the working memory is to think of it a little bit like a stage in a theatre. The stage has limited resources, and for the purposes of this illustration, let's assume that our stage has one microphone and one spotlight. Now, when there is only one actor on stage, they have the full use of that microphone and spotlight. When a second actor comes onto the stage, there is still only the same resources. There is still only the one microphone and one spotlight. So they're having to compete for the use of those resources. So if we think about, instead of actors, think about tasks. Instead of a stage, our brain. When the brain is focusing on one task, our working memory on one task, it has all the resources of the brain, the working memory to hand. However, when we try to multitask, when we try to bring a second task on board, the brain doesn't suddenly get more resources. It's still the same amount of resource. Meaning the resource, therefore, has to be shared. In summary, we need to remember that the brain is not an infinite resource. Conscious thinking part of the brain has limited resources, as we've just spoken about with the working memory and the stage. It has the capacity to hold, just remember, maximum of 3 pieces of information. And if we choose to ignore these simple rules, then the brain becomes overloaded and our subconscious brain takes control, which in turn, the first thing the subconscious brain does when it takes control is it asks itself the question, am I safe? To which the answer will be no, because the brain is overloaded. So a threat response is going to be triggered, meaning access to cognitive thinking is impaired, making it harder to work, harder to think. Of our brain's capacity. First of all, we can stop multitasking. We spoke earlier about the negative impact it can have upon our well-being and our performance. Every 90 minutes, our brains need a break. Just a couple of minutes, just long enough really to check in with yourself, stretch your legs, stand up, move about. So is important. Where's this multitasking myth come from? It puts unrealistic, on all of us to juggle. I think it was just people thought they could try and do 2 things together, and because we didn't have the science available to back it up at the time. I mean, the science is all relatively new. When I say relatively new, in the last 20 years or so. So it's kind of all still new in scientific terms. And I think it was just the expectations put on employees that, productivity the people needed, or our organizations needed more and more and more from us, and there weren't enough hours in a day. So what do? We try and do 2 things together, I think is the answer to that, Joanne. So make sure you take a lunch break. Now, it's so easy to say, I am too busy to have a lunch break, but that's a false economy. Walk away from your workspace. And especially when we're working from home, this applies just as much. Take a minimum of a 30-minute break away from your desk, away from your PC, and give your mind a rest. If you can, if it's nice enough, go out, get some fresh air, walk about. You'll feel so much better for it. Also, thoughts. Be mindful of your thoughts. Are they helpful or hindering thoughts that you're having? Reword them, reframe them. Look for the positives in a situation. Words are the nutrients of the brain. So ask yourself, what are you feeding your brain? Often do you use language such as can't, won't, shouldn't, couldn't? And not just conscious level. This is where we really do need to kind of think about what's going on in our unconscious level, that little inner critique who's always talking away in the back of our mind, telling us we're not good enough, we can't do that, we shouldn't do that. We need to be much more aware of that, because these are all blockers to being able to see opportunities and possibilities. Leveraging the power of the mind is making sure we do take those breaks. We switch our technology off. Don't become addicted to it. If necessary, schedule time in your diaries where technology will become completely switched off. Remember, technology frazzles the brain if we overuse it. It can be very helpful, used correctly. Overused just leads to frazzle. Brain frazzle, as it's now referred to. Workload is another way of increasing your productivity. You know, all the usual things, schedule time in your diary to focus on specific tasks. Don't overplan your diary. Leave space for flexibility for those urgent and important tasks, because they're going to crop up. We know they're going to crop up. So build in some flexibility into your diary. Then we know it doesn't send the brain into panic that suddenly I've got all this extra work to do. Try and only handle emails and paper once. Read in action, read in file, or read in bin and delete it. Don't overschedule Zoom calls and online meetings. Leave space between calls, between your meetings. 10, 15 minutes. Try scheduling meetings for just 50 minutes so that it gives you 10 minutes before your next meeting is going to start. Consider alternatives to Zoom. It suddenly feels like we hardly ever pick the telephone up anymore these days, because let's pop on Zoom. Actually, sometimes the same outcome can be achieved through a telephone call or even an email. Set yourself priorities and boundaries and stick to those boundaries. A quick question for you. Hours. What do you think that could be referring to? It's actually 2.1 hours per day. What am I referring to? Any thoughts? Just pop it in chat. Fully focus. Nice thought, actually. It's not actually that, Emily, but it's a good guess. First two. Time we lose each day due to unhelpful distractions. So just think, again, a reflective question. What could you do with an extra time lost to social media? Yeah, Donna. What could you do with an extra 2 hours every day? I think if we could just claw back that 2 hours. Well, here's some of the kind of most common ways we lose time. It's through voicemails, emails, and other people. Emily said sleep. We get 2.1 hours sleep a day. Yeah, it sometimes feels like that, doesn't it? So some strategies to help us manage interruptions to be more productive. Set times for checking emails. You know, let other people know, put an auto response or an email footer that actually tells people you'll only check emails at specific times. Set those boundaries that I mentioned, you know, when you will be available. Don't be afraid to say no sometimes. Your judgment of when it's appropriate and making sure the circumstances, you know, are right to actually say no, but don't be afraid to say no sometimes. Experience. The reason that people don't tend to do these things more is more to do with their own beliefs and attitudes than anyone else's. Human beings to belong. That's a deep innate need that we have got. And the way we do that is believing that people need us. And our brain tells itself that we cannot manage, that other people manage without us. It's our way of validating ourselves. Now, this is all going on at an unconscious processing level. It's not something we consciously particularly think about. For an awful lot of times, we kind of tell ourselves, I couldn't possibly, switch my emails off, switch my technology off. Actually, it's the brain who is telling us that. It's not helpful particularly, and it is not necessarily a fact. Scary in the first instance, but people that actually do try it are amazed at the difference it makes to their productivity and their stress levels, their energy levels. And important at the moment for people who are working from home. We need to set those boundaries. We need to let people know when we can be interrupted, when we can't be interrupted, etc. Perhaps try having if you haven't got one, try having a quiet space. And this applies in an office as much as at home, somewhere where people can go to when they just need quiet, focused time. Managing our interruptions is we need to take ownership for managing our distractions. It's too easy it's other people interrupting me. Actually, it's because I'm not managing that situation. So we need to own the situation. Actually influence it. A cluttered mind, overloading your mind with things that you need to do. Actually, download it, as I say, onto paper, write things down, prioritize and plan them. If you feel that your mind is just getting cluttered with everything, just take a short break, go for a walk, have a cup of tea, meditate for a few minutes. Because as we know, the mind has got limited capacity. And if you're trying to kind of hold everything in the mind, all you're going to do is trigger that stress response. Untidy and cluttered work areas can also create distractions for the mind. So clear and organize your workspace. Make sure your workspace is an appropriate workspace. And again, this has been more of an issue for people who were forced to work from home. So, but not all office space is actually designed to accommodate the people's different behavioral needs and preferences. So actually working in an office can be a distraction sometime. One example that always kind of springs to mind with this is large open plan offices, which can create distractions both for introverts and for extroverts, actually. So think about your working actual space. Is that in itself a distraction? And what can you do to manage that? Are our own thoughts and emotions. And these can include thoughts about pressing responsibilities or pleasant things that you'd rather be doing. It can also include emotions about life circumstances, tasks that you're working on, fears, worries. Circumstances like major world events and personal struggles can all be sources of our own internal distractions. Now, most people believe that external interruptions and distractions are by far the biggest robbers of our time. Yet in reality, we tend to lose more time due to our own internal distractions. So a few of the things that we can do to manage our own internal distractions. Larger tasks and break them down to smaller chunks, and then schedule the smaller chunks into your diary, no more than an hour at a time. Where you do your best work, which, as we've seen, can be different locations for different tasks even. Write down your distracting thoughts. By writing down those thoughts, the brain then knows those thoughts are safe and won't be forgotten. So it can it won't get stressed. It won't try and hang on to those thoughts. Make sure you get good quality sleep and a little bit more than 2 hours a night. Practice self-regulation. Manage your own behaviors. Take that responsibility to manage your behaviors and your thoughts. And a real big one is manage your autopilot. So managing our autopilot is about being mindful, being present and aware, and choosing when it's helpful to be on autopilot, because there are times when we're doing repetitive tasks that use very little cognitive thought that in actual fact, it serves as well to be on autopilot. And overloaded, the subconscious mind takes over. And that's when it will go then onto autopilot, because the brain believes that it actually then needs to go into plan and do even more planning to survive. And we overstretch ourselves and leaves ourselves no flexibility in our schedules. We cut back or possibly cut out breaks because we believe we don't have the time, because the brain is in survival mode. It's in autopilot of planning. We know that that's a false belief and counterintuitive to what we should be doing. So can we train our minds to be less distracted, to be more present, to focus on what we need to get for an important task to get done? The good news is, yes, we can. And we do this by, or one of the ways we can do this is by practicing mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is quite simply about being present right here, right now, in both body and mind. Waking hours. So half of the time we've been on this webinar, for example, your mind isn't present on what you are doing. The task in hand is not receiving your full attention, 49% of our waking hours. So you'll recall earlier when I talked about multitasking, I mentioned that we were training our brain to be distracted, making it harder to focus. So what we need to do is find a way that when we do need to focus on something, we've got that option of being able to choose to be present. Is quite simply a tool. It's been scientifically proven to help reduce stress and levels of anxiety and overwhelm, but it also increase our levels of attentional intelligence, which is our ability to be able to choose to pay attention and focus and have control over what our mind chooses to focus on. It's programmed to be curious, to wonder. It's all linked to our survival instinct, all about keeping us safe. Our minds are constantly scanning the environment around us to make sure that we're safe. But before we look at what mindfulness is, let's be clear about what it's not. It's not about sitting cross-legged and chanting for 40 or 50 minutes a day. Quite simply, mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the moment, and non-judgmentally. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures that I use when practicing focused attention. And all I do, and while I'm talking, you can perhaps try this yourself, just bring in all of your attention and focus to the picture. Be really curious, look at the picture, going deeper into it, being drawn into it, bringing all that attention. And just taking a note, if you were to kind of stare at this photograph for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just looking at it, being really curious about it, you would notice at some point that your mind would start to wander. And all we guide our mind, as soon as we become aware of it, just gently guide our mind back to the picture. Now, it doesn't have to be a beautiful picture. To practice focused attention, you can pick something as simple as a spot, a mark on the wall to focus on. and you just bring all your attention and keep focused on that and bringing your attention back to it every time the mind wanders. And by helps us to train our mind to be more focused, so that when we need to focus, because we've got an important piece of work to do and we need to be productive, we can actually choose to do so. Reasons people don't actually try mindfulness and really is they're unsure how to start, or they believe they don't have time. Long periods of time. It's better to get started and commit to just doing a few minutes than to not start at all. I once had somebody actually say to me, Michelle, the most I can commit to is a minute a day. I said, fine. They were right, really surprised actually that I said yes, take that minute. But now they've actually built that practice up and they now actually check in with themselves, being mindful 4 or 5 times throughout the day for 3, 4, 5 minutes a time. So how do you get started? Well, set yourself some reminders to check in with yourself, first of all, every 90 minutes or so, just to focus on how you're feeling. What's your thoughts? You know, what's going on for you? There's also a proverb, when walking, walk, and eating, eat. That reminds us to focus on doing one thing at a time. Don't try eating your lunch while you're working. You don't get the benefit and you will be less productive. Be mindful almost any time, doing everyday chores such as washing up, brushing your teeth. Bring all your attention onto brushing your teeth. It all helps us to build up that focused attention. It's called a mindful practice. So don't beat yourself up if you forget to do it or you struggle to get your mind to actually settle. Just remember, the mind is a naturally wandering organ, so it will wander away, but just gently guide it back. The more you're training your mind to be able to focus and pay attention, resulting in less time spent feeling stressed and overwhelmed and giving you those higher levels of productivity. In kind of summing up, we've looked at a number of tools and techniques which, if we implement them, will help us to achieve more when demands are high and time is short. What next? Well, if you want opportunities to delve deeper into behavioural preferences, you know, we do one-to-one coaching sessions. You can have, I've got some spare appointments in the next week, actually. I've got a couple of spare slots there if anybody wants a free consultation, just to have a chat about the webinar today, behavioural preferences, becoming a licensee, anything regarding what we've been kind of touching on and speaking about today. I'm also having a virtual, if you want to try the jigsaw tool and build your own behavioural map. We're doing a free showcase on the 18th of March that you'd be very welcome to join us at. So you can also visit our website where we regularly put blogs and articles relating to behaviour and current kind of topics that are important within the world of work. So we literally have come to the end of our time, but if anybody has got any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer any questions that you may have. If you want to pop anything in chat, I'm happy to do so, and stay online for a moment or two if you'd like to do that.